We have a subject today that has largely been neglected, but we need to talk about it because the people who dream of a world Marxist government ruling a one world government have been busy at work for a long, long time. They've adopted as the horse that they will ride to victory the cause of global warming. We're going to show you that today. And I want to go right now to an article. It's entitled, UN IPCC Official Admits We Redistribute the World's Wealth by Climate Policy. This article is written by Noel Shepard. If you needed any more evidence that the entire theory of man-made global warming was a scheme to redistribute wealth, you got it Sunday when a leading member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that very thing. Now, this is in an interview with Germany's NZZ Online. It begins like this. The new thing about your proposal for a global deal is the stress on the importance of development policy for climate policy. Until now, many think of aid when they hear development policy. The answer, this is by Ottmar Edenhofer, a UN IPCC official. That will change immediately if global emission rights are distributed. If this happens on a per capita basis, then Africa will be the big winner and huge amounts of money will flow there. Okay, we've got to stop here because some of you may be looking at me and saying, what? Well, here's the big plan. The big plan is to put limits on the consumption or the emission of carbon into the atmosphere. Every business, every home, every person will be allotted a carbon footprint. If you exceed that footprint, now this is the legislation that they want to pass. It's already what the Kyoto Treaty does. Now they're wanting a new climate change treaty, as they call it, that will immediately upon exceeding your particular footprint, force you to start buying carbon credits. They're already doing this in Europe right now, in the European Union, because they signed the Kyoto Treaty. America decided not to sign the Kyoto Treaty. So what happens is when you exceed your allotment of carbon emissions, you now have to start purchasing those from a nation that isn't using all of their allotted carbon credits. Now, obviously, the industrialized nations will run out of their carbon emission credits long before a non-industrialized nation. As a matter of fact, the third world nations will not use theirs at all, or at least very little of them. So here's what's going to happen. By the way, this will be expensive. The people who need more carbon emission credits will purchase them from Zimbabwe or some of the nations, the third world powers, that don't use all of theirs. So the effect is all this money, and we're talking about billions here, all of this money will flow then from the have nations to the have not nations, from the industrialized nations to those who are not yet developed. Now, that's the concept, and the goal is wealth redistribution. There were shockwaves sent through the people of America back when President Obama was running for president the first time. Joe the plumber became famous, and he said to President Obama, now then, if I, as a plumber, exceed a certain amount of money, then you're going to dramatically up my tax rate. Is that true? And it's interesting what President Obama, to become president, actually had to say. He said, well, it is true, and he attempted to take the sting out of what was going to happen. But then he finally said, once you get over $250,000 a year, your tax rate is going to go up. Oh, Joe the Brr said, so what you're really doing is redistributing wealth using the tax system. And President Obama, well, I think we need to share the wealth. So what he was really doing was endorsing the redistribution of wealth, which is the central plank in the platform of the world Marxist. When their platform was set way back, what was it, 1917 or something like that, when their platform was set, they built into that there needed to be a progressive income tax. So the more you make, the more the government takes from you and gives to someone else. Now, someone said it like this: when one person receives something that they did not earn, another person earns something that they did not receive. So the government in Marxism forcibly, at the barrel of a gun, because it's forced upon the populace, the money's taken from them and then given to other people by means of welfare. It's taken from them through taxation, and obviously they don't have a choice as to whether they pay taxes or not unless they want to go to jail. Okay, so this is what we're speaking of here, and this person in this interview, Mr. Ottmar Edenhofer, said that once global emission rights are distributed, every single nation and then every single person is going to be issued a certain amount of global emission rights. Once that happens, he said Africa will be the big winner because Africa is undeveloped, non-industrialized territory, so they don't have a lot of carbon emissions, but they're going to have a lot to sell at a very attractive price. Okay. Now, NZZ says that does not sound any more like the climate policy that we know. Edenhofer. Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separately from the major themes of globalization. I want to make sure that we all understand this term, globalization. We never heard this term until after the fall of the Berlin Wall. After George Bush Sr. announced the birth of the New World Order, we started hearing this term, globalization. Corporations began to have meetings, and they would pull their people in and say, from now on, we must think globally. The term, it's a global village, was coined. So what does this term globalization then mean? Well, Strobe Talbot said it best in his famous article in Time magazine, July the 20th of 1992. His article was called Birth of the Global Nation. And in there he stated that national sovereignty as we have known it will cease to exist in the 21st century. He said we will all answer to a single global authority. So what he's saying is we're going to be in a world government system. In order to get from where we were back at the fall of the Berlin Wall to this dream of one world government, by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev was the person that facilitated the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he was a communist. He never renounced his communism. So when the Berlin Wall fell, we then moved into globalization. Globalization, simply defined, means to globalize the world, to move away from the nation-state structure of our world to a global governance system. I'll never forget, it's been a number of years ago now, that I took a tour to the United Nations. I had about 50 people with me, so we had requested a special briefing. They took us into a room, sort of like a theater, and there we had an official from the United Nations speak to us. He went to the podium and he said, now, the United Nations is not a world government. We're not a global government. The United Nations is in global governance. And when he said that, I had previously in my studies looked up global governance because it was a term that was beginning to be used prominently in the news. And I looked up global governance and it said world government or global government because governance and government is the same thing. Well, when Mr. Haas, that was the name of the man who was giving the speech at the UN, when he made that statement, I just didn't feel like I could let it ride. I raised my hand and I said, could you please explain to us? I thought maybe he did have an explanation. Could you explain to us the difference between global governance and global government? He stopped a moment, stepped back from the podium, swallowed real hard, and said, well, that may not be easy. Well, I didn't think it was going to be easy because I had already looked up the definition of the two terms in the dictionary, and they are synonymous. So when we talk about globalization, listen to what Mr. Edenhofer had to say once again. Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separately from the major themes of globalization. So these two things are hooked together. Climate policy is really the means to implement globalization or a one-world governmental system. NZZ then said, de facto, this means an expropriation of the countries with natural resources. This leads to a very different development from that which has been triggered by development policy. The United Nations adopted developmental policy goals quite a number of years ago, and all the world has been following these goals. These developmental policies had to do with the have-not nations or the underdeveloped nations. And so all of the nations in the United Nations agreed to pursue these developmental policies. Well, now that Mr. Edenhofer says that the expropriation of the countries with natural resources, when they send their natural resources to the developed countries, it's going to cause an exceeding of global carbon emissions, which means we'll have to send additional wealth back to those countries. We'll be back.